well-crafted box text design, some potential alternatives that you can use during your work. I'd like to start by introducing each of my panelists. So I'll be starting with Merric Blackman, published more than a few ventures, and has about 15 years or so, as far as I can tell, it may go even further, of discussion about RPG design. Everybody, Merric Blackman. I also have with me today Brandon O'Brien, poetry editor for Faya.
Yes, that's how that's pronounced.
I'm
got it in one.
Proud to have gotten that in one. A speculative fiction, science fiction magazine that honestly is amazing. And also creator of more than a few wonderful indie role-playing games. And finally, acting as our anti-hero, I have Thor, editor-in-chief of Burning Wheel HQ. Can I call it Burning Wheel HQ, or is it just the letters?
Or can, or BWHQ, also acceptable.
And also the writer of one of my favorite role-playing systems of all time, Torchbearer.
Oh, thank you so much.
Just so everybody's aware, we'll be doing a short, hopefully, presentation discussing the history of box text before we move into Q&A and then audience questions and answers. So let's get started on that little endeavor. The first thing we want to make clear to everybody that our goal here is to help writers improve their writing through a clear, concentrated, deliberate thought, thinking through all of the decisions you're making. We do not assume that you have played in any of these adventures or have read any of these adventures, but you should be aware of what makes your writing style unique. If you are not sure what it is that makes you special, you should know that these adventures we're going to talk about are a survey of nearly everything I can think of when it comes to adventure design, and will be a great opportunity for you to explore alternative design options. We are going to be talking about the creation of high effort content. That doesn't mean it's quality. But what we've noticed, or at least I've noticed, and my fellow panelists have agreed somewhat with that belief system, is that the tabletop RPG landscape relearns the same lessons over and over and over again, unlike other industries, like the film industry, who have a very, very well-developed theories when it comes to craft of film or literature, poetry. All of these take time and effort to teach new writers the lessons from the past. So we're going to be talking about some idioms, basically, that can help you when it comes to your writing. One of the big lessons that we can take away is from industries like the film industry, which state outright that you should not make use of narrative text, if possible. Really shy away from just telling people facts about your movie. You have to demonstrate everything in camera. And it's one of the secrets to making quality content. It's just follow the rules and the idioms. And I'm sorry, I'm getting interrupted here by some. Okay. I apologize. That was an accident. Right, I should probably discuss the elephant in the room. That was one of the most iconic moments in filmmaking history. Everything we're going to discuss today should be freely disregarded as long as you are aware of what you're doing. You can ignore the policy of don't just dump information into your audience head if you know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So take all of these lessons with a grain of salt, that we are attempting to learn why something works and when something doesn't work, and when it may be appropriate to ignore those standard rules that we are going to be discussing. Box text has been with us since the literal invention of tabletop role-playing games, as far as I can tell. Adventures were released with scenes and blank pages, like literal lines for the dungeon with nothing contained into it, and told dungeon masters to write in what they think would be appropriate in this particular room. However, even then, everybody acknowledged that, well, this isn't necessarily the best system, but what it is the most effective system. Storytelling, especially storytelling that is supposed to have consequences, requires decisions to be made, and for those decisions to feel like they have weight. So context is key of a wide variety of situations, whether you're doing a traditional dungeon crawl or an in-depth exploration of the psyche of some vampire living on the top of a castle, causing pain and suffering to the surrounding land. Just telling people facts tends to be the best way to communicate context. But it doesn't make for great storytelling. Very early on in box text, in the history of RPGs, box text was therefore not well understood. We didn't understand what made compelling narratives. We didn't understand how much is too much. We didn't even know who our audience was going to be for box text. Are we writing for the dungeon master as they're reading it because, hey, you want to have a fun time while reading an adventure? There's a perfectly valid way to engage with the medium. We didn't know if you were supposed to be writing towards the players, but that seems really hard to do. Or if the purpose was just to facilitate play between the dungeon master and the players, which meant we got some pretty crazy decisions. Early history is pretty amazing to read through, actually. There would be a lot of subject matter that we could dive through. We could look at combat situation, box text, or how to present puzzle information. For our purposes, we're going to only discuss one particular kind of scene, following the scene theory of narrative design. We're going to be discussing the favor, or an NPC is going to come to the party someplace and ask the party to do them a favor because they are the player characters. We're going to take 3 different solutions that we've seen and then talk about how they implement this pretty basic concept. We'll start with the Temple of the Frog. The foremost figure reaches into the folds of his robes and pulls forth a gold coin. With a flick of his hand, he tosses it onto the center of the table. The Temple of the Frog was a 1986 adventure written for Blackman, a pretty grungy, thief-based interpretation of Dungeons and Dragons. If I'll be completely honest, a bonkers adventure. It's a lot of fun. However, it does have one of the strangest decisions, in my opinion, for setting up the adventure. Before you begin play, a dungeon master reads 3 pages of text that provides just context for why nobody else can go on this particular adventure. And then, after you've finished all of your context, you get 2.5 pages of descriptive text stating the party is in a tavern and the tavern is awful and you're eating greasy, gray, old mutton. It goes on and on and on. It includes one of the strangest bit of instructive text I've ever seen. PCs should recognize this coin as a Theonian coin. There's one thing I can identify. It's Assyrian coins from 4,000 years ago at sight. The second they land in front of me, I know this. This is a fact. This adventure puts a lot of pressure on the players. It dictates what your characters eat. It dictates how the characters respond. It sets up a moment scene with no interaction. Eagle-eye observers of Temple of the Frog will, of course, tell me, "Oh, this is ridiculous, Rob. You just misremembered this entire situation." There's all of this context because the adventure starts. This is the second part in the trilogy. So you can't, in the middle, you need a bunch of context. And there's an alternative start where this whole sequence never happens. And that alternative start is even more difficult to run. Instead, you get a page and 3/4 of box text describing a bunch of bandits ambushing the party in basic Dungeons and Dragons. The party is expected to defeat this group of bandits. And then an NPC will walk out, announce loudly to the party, "I am the one that hired the bandits to try and kill you, and you've proven capable because you defeated them." We get, again, the most wonderful piece of instructive text that you can ever have. The NPC may need to overcome some objections from sourheads. "I don't know about you, but historically, player characters, when somebody's paid to ambush you, will arrest that person and bring them in for questioning. And if not for the fact that you have a page of box text ahead of it, informing the NPC that this character has plot armor, that's exactly the way players would behave." All of these point to a fundamental problem that exists when designing adventures. Box text, and especially in regards to adventure writing, has a lot of potential problems. It establishes a power dynamic between the players and the dungeon masters. The dungeon master is now determining immutable facts about the world. If it goes on for as long as, for instance, that speech I just gave, it's really difficult to follow what is happening. It shatters the flow of play, and usually it doesn't even help a dungeon master engage with the players. And the reason all of these things can happen is because of the fundamental problem. You have no concept of who is going to be playing your adventure. I love this comic because this articulates the exact problem writers for tabletop RPGs have to resolve. Slap Happy Jack is a clown, and he throws pies at people. And that's pretty much describes nearly every game of Dungeons and Dragons or any RPG people are going to engage with at some point. There's going to be some player who shows up and says, "I'm playing Slap Happy Jack." But Slap Happy Jack, after like a year and a half of play, they're going to be a completely different character. You're going to have a character with relationships and willing to sacrifice themselves to save all of their friends. We have to design adventures that will accept all of these characters in whatever state they're in and give them the chance to change or make meaningful choices in the middle of play. Having said all of that, I think it's a good idea to examine where we have gone with that fundamental problem. We're going to talk about an adventure that came out 3 years ago, which I admit is a pretty significant jump to go from 1986 to 2017. But there were very major developments in role-playing game history during those particular time points. We're going to jump into Day at the Races by Rudy Rutenberg. A rich purple sash over loose layers of vibrant yellows and orange denotes her station as a Port Nyanzaru bookie. Name's Mabula. Yous look like the mob that they sent me. Box text design changed significantly. Mostly because people started to get an understanding of what needs to occur in adventures. We identified that themes are a huge component of making something stick with people's minds. But the hard part is figuring out how to represent those themes. I like this particular selection of decision made in Rudy Rutenberg's Day of the Races. So the plot in Day of the Races is you are expected to go to a city and you participate in a dinosaur race, which is justification enough for most players to go on an adventure. Rudy decided to introduce a character to act as an intermediary between the player character's start of the adventure and the getting to the race. This could have been represented by a handout or or just like a hawker or somebody in passing. He chose to engage with Mabula. We don't know a lot about Mabula, but we do get two pieces of information that are not present in this particular text. First, Mabula has been learning Common since the start of this morning. And second, that she struggles with the letter S. Every single time that I've run this particular adventure, a character has been playing the adventure and gone, hang on, I've noticed something. This character is avoiding certain words and like deliberately doing so. Like saying, instead of heading up a flight of stairs, say we're going to go up, and then pause, panic, and say here. This signals a play opportunity for that character. And that character, when they say things like, I would like to speak Choltian to Mabula, and then Mabula gets to go, oh my God, I thought nobody would be able to understand me. I'm going to keep speaking in Common because there's other people here, but if I need help, can I ask you for help? It signaled to players an opportunity, and it rewarded those players who would make a, say, non-standard decision. But beyond that, it also signaled to players that language is going to be a key component of this series of adventures in the Tomb of Annihilation. Which resulted in, and you can see this through the discussion points, a lot of people asking how they can learn Cholton. You can signal, and the punishment for not picking up on the signal was extremely low. You still got to go on the dinosaur race, but you might have missed this small moment of character development and opportunity to feel special. It's an incredible thematic choice, a real opportunity to pull something out. However, Mabula also became famous because she's written using I dialect, or the common vernacular, or, she was written to speak as she would speak. This made some players uncomfortable and made people ask, is there a better way of presenting information? We're gonna have to move on from Day of the Races, but this is a key component whenever you're making a design decision. No matter what you choose to do, there will be costs and benefits. You want to understand the costs and benefits you're making when you're making any design decision. There are a ton of advantages that we actually pull out because of this. The decision to use box text design. The first is that a major theme could be brought straight to the forefront. You cannot miss this particular opportunity. Second, and I didn't really get to discuss this, it provides an emotional reset for player characters. The scene before you actually meet Mabula, the player characters are running around in a festival, getting to have solo adventures and chances to taste and experience. After Mabula interacts with everybody, people go, here's a centralized point of interaction, and let's all calm down and start some sort of joint investigation. And it can do all of that to the benefit of an adventure or to the detriment of an adventure. Box text brings whatever you write into it directly into play, regardless of the opinion of the players or the dungeon masters. But I would not be doing any justice if we did not talk about the fact that there are methods to do the exact same goals that both those previous adventures did without using box text. Tomb of Black Sand is a 2019 adventure written by Jacob Hurst. In the adventure, the players are expected to go wander out and discover a tomb filled with black sand. The Tomb of Black Sand's method to get the party to engage with it is really innovative. They have a bunch of different ways, but the most direct way, or the way that's relevant to our discussions, is Niles Flax. He's a barkeep in a very small town, and he has two facts about him. Number one, he likes to talk to people. And number two, he's got some problems because the forest has been experiencing a blight. Using only literally the information present on this page, we get a really evocative scene. There's an inn. It's got a bunch of people inside of it. It's the largest structure in the particular town. Niles will approach the party and try to engage with them, and rewards the party for engaging with him, and will ask them a favor. They tie back to the themes of the adventure, and observant player characters will get to have an aha moment when they go, why are there so many dead bodies here? Wasn't Niles in a war? Are we in the aftermath of the war? There's a lot of tendrils lancing out from this text, even though it looks very, very short. This means that player characters and dungeon masters can pick up the threads that they want to tie together into the bundle of rope that will be the narrative they're trying to explore. Now, there are consequences to this design, though. First, you cannot guarantee a particular play experience. Second, oftentimes player characters like to choose the path of least resistance, so they'll just ignore uncomfortable things. But Tomb of Black Sand demonstrates to us we can do a ton with very little words if we are careful about which words we choose to include. The more you can do with less, the more play space opens up for players to enjoy. All right, my final thoughts before we move into Q&A. First, I want to re-emphasize to everybody that box text is a point of contention and will always be a point of contention, because there's no right answer for when you should use it and when you shouldn't. There are far more alternatives nowadays than we had way back in the past. But that comes about because of the basic tenets of being a good writer or a dungeon master. You have to be experimenting if you hope to improve. You have to find people outside of your little circle to pull and grow from. And you have to take those lessons from playing and engaging with other people and add it into your own play style. But I will note that the most important element for improving yourself as a writer is the old de facto. You gotta start writing. Now I'm gonna bring us into some questions and answers, and we're gonna pull ourselves back into presentation view, panelists view, so everybody can see each other and talk delightfully. So I'm gonna start with the obvious question, everybody. How'd that go? What do you guys think of pretty basic theory?
Yeah, well, the very early days of adventure writing, there was no box text at all, and it slowly came along. What's really interesting when you look at the very old modules is that they've got box text which isn't in a box. So the description of an encounter starts off with something which today we would recognize as box text, but it just then runs on into the actual description of the encounter. And this Gygax, especially in his early adventures, you're reading this evocative text, and right, is this for the players? And then it goes, oh, I don't want to read this. This is for the DM. So you could get problem. The sectioning off of the box text is really important to say, this is for the players, this is for the DM.
You can really see him varying it based on throughout the adventures, right? I was just looking at Keep on the Borderlands, which is 1979, right? And there is a very short sort of intro read-along text, a paragraph when you get to the Caves of Chaos. But the actual keyed scenes within have no read-along text whatsoever. No. It's just a very straightforward, this is what's here, in a sentence or even a sentence fragment. And I would add that I think it is one of his very best adventures.
Yes. Feels fair.
Yeah, and so you've got this idea of its presentation. So this is what the players need to start off knowing. And it's a way of telling the DM, the players need to know this. And it's interesting to see when people do it in another way, like in the Black Sand adventure, that occasionally it gets mixed up. And the biggest problem which you have when you don't use box text is presenting the information so that the DM knows what to tell the players, especially when it's a complex scene. Yeah.
I'm going to have to turn to Brandon now and ask for their thoughts on the basic presentation.
One of the things that stand out to me, kind of obviously, as someone who very recently has design experience, but before that was a writer, is that like the challenge when it comes to running and reading a tabletop role-playing game, from my perspective, is playing the game is an act of collaborative storytelling, but it requires somebody to lead the dance in terms of what the story is. And that role is obviously the DM's role. So we give the DM all of these tools to start telling the story. But the challenge is, if you give the DM too many tools that are designed specifically to tell a story, then the DM is just a storyteller and you could just write a book. When you go like the other way from that and just give the DM enough presumptive tools with which they can tell a story, but they're not sure how those things tie together, then all you've done is give them a series of well-sketched characters with no instructions about how to use the sketch that you have in mind. Like, the Black Sand adventure stands out to me as actually really brilliant. Niles Flax is an absolutely interesting character from the way that text is described. But if the DM doesn't know how to use any of the information that's been given, it's just a character sketch that's really good. And how you balance those things is really difficult. And I essentially we're here because trying to bridge that gap in terms of how do you do one without getting in the way of the other is actually really, really challenging.
It's very difficult.
To that point, I would suggest, and feel free to disagree with me, that one of the things we need to keep in mind is that this idea of read-along text, if you're going to use it at all, I think it works best in key location-based adventures, and not so well for situation-based or relationship map-based adventures or scenarios.
I actually have a question that I wanted to ask that is vaguely related to that, because there's one situation in adventure writing, especially when you're trying to evoke a world, that I often see we don't utilize box text, but it seems like it would be effective the scenario or relationship situation. However, it's going to get a little gritty, just so everybody's aware. In other forms of storytelling, people will figure out their own words or dialects to describe particular actions. Like the obvious example being bending in Avatar, since everybody's been watching that lately. There's a special word for this thing that exists inside the universe. And it's really difficult to figure out ways to communicate that information. Like science fiction RPGs often run into this problem, and they just write down in the rule book, this is fast FTL travel, and that's it. Player characters often just start defaulting to their own words. I can't tell you how many times I've played a Star Trek RPG and had people just say, let's go to warp, or activate the hyperdrive, because it's just more commonly used in their background. I want to know what maybe some shui ways to introduce different terminology into conversations. I'm really glad that hit. I was very proud of that joke, Brandon. I'm hoping
I have
you
a lot of
speak
feelings
to that.
about that word. I have a lot of feelings about that word in particular. Minor plug, I wrote an entire essay about how I hate the word shui. But that concern obviously stands out to me because especially a lot of the RPGs that we play, most of the RPGs that we play are genre work. They're very strongly science fiction, very strongly fantasy. Whenever we stray into something that is not one of those two genres, we're still clinging to a particular genre that often has its own dialect as well. Like whenever we do something in the film noir, hard-boiled detective range, just stuff like that. And those things obviously come with their own jargon. And a lot of the times I think we just kind of get by with the assumption that at least players know enough that if they're talking to each other, it will work. When I feel like what would be far more useful as a result is to create space in games where whatever words the players use dictates the way that that world feels as a result. That we're not telling them how they're supposed to feel about a certain kind of language. We're telling them that whatever language you agree on is the language that has been operating in this world the whole time. And just give them definitions so they know what they're referring to. But that's also very difficult because sometimes you're also dealing with an element of your universe that is new and therefore needs to have a name, or a context that not everybody, even who has operated within the same genre space, would know. Like everybody in a science fiction space knows what FTL travel is because we've all read at least or watched one show where FTL travel is used. But if you do something particularly novel, that needs to have a name for them to know what it is. But we never actually operate on the sense of, well, is this natural to everybody that's playing this thing? Have we just dropped an entire understanding of how people would speak about this thing without ever considering that maybe this is not actually useful or obvious to them?
This is like a personal opinion question, okay? I do want you guys to really dig down deep and consider the answer for your particular writing style, though. When you are writing, who are you writing for? Are you writing for the person who's going to be at the table running the adventure? Are you writing for the person who's reading the adventure? Are you attempting that extra step to go beyond that person to the actual players engaging in the game?
You know, when you ask the question, it actually becomes really intensely baffling. Because a lot of how I think about the work of writing an adventure is similar to the work of writing a play, in the sense that, in much the same way that an adventure is instructions for players as to how to engage with the setting that they've now entered as they're being led by the DM. A play is instructions for players on how to engage with the setting that they've now entered is being led by a director. So you are writing for the director to be able to give proper instructions to their cast. But that means that you also need to engage with the cast, because if the text is impenetrable for them, then they're just not going to play it. So I do think a lot, like my own process does involve a lot of that, a lot of being aware that I'm not writing for necessarily the DM's engagement, but so that the DM has enough very accessible tools that they can pass on that information to any individual player, and that player knows what's going on. So that engagement is more important than the text itself speaking immediately to the DM, or even the text speaking immediately to the player.
Thor, what about you when you're writing adventures?
I think Brandon said it very well. You had mentioned earlier that, the idea of facilitating the experience between the game master and the players, and that is always on my mind. And whether I succeed or not is, I'll leave that up to the rest of you to judge. It's really about, does the game master have the tools to present, what's going on to the players in a way that they can understand it and engage with it. I'm not interested in telling the game master a story. As an adventure designer, I don't consider myself a storyteller, right? The story, I think, is what happens, when they finish playing that adventure, when the game master and the players have finished playing and they look back and they say, that's what happened. That's when the story happens.
Merric, I'm curious your thoughts.
Yes. So I'm writing for the DM so that they can convey the adventure to the players. I do think that I need to give them the tools that a story can be created from it. There wants to be enough guidelines, so it isn't just, here's a bunch of monsters, here's a bunch of treasure, you work out how they relate. You need some sort of structure there so that they can go from that into actually running something. But it doesn't have to be dictatorial one way through it.
Yeah.
The art is trying to give them as much agency as possible while still making it possible for the DM to have something there to run.
To have something to form a decision about.
We're going to ask a few questions that have been submitted to us by our own audience. So Paul Beakley has asked, have you ever found a sweet spot where directly read aloud text is long enough to impart its meaning, but short enough that even people who cannot pay attention to anything will get the information and internalize it?
No. I don't think there is a length which universally works. People want different things, but the general thing which I'm seeing from MT Black and a bunch of the other D&D designers at the moment is you've got 2 or 3 sentences.
Yes.
And I've got to say that 2 or 3 sentences is not enough for some use of box text. But it's partly just understanding why you're using it in this case. There's setting up or closing out a scenario is different to what's happening in the middle of a scenario. And I think there are different box text lengths for those.
Brandon.
So I agree with Merric that the ideal length is no. The logic that Merric applies there works for any length of text in any medium. I personally find. If your concern is holding people's attention, you have 2 sentences at most. Not trying to stray too far into 50 words even. But not only does that obviously not fit certain circumstances where you need to deliver a certain kind of information or lots of things are happening at once, but even then, the issue then becomes, now that you've given this amount of information for everybody to get started, there is still information to follow. The concern to me is not necessarily what is the sweet spot when it comes to this, but is every single bit of text lining up in such a way that all of them are fulfilling their purpose, running from one to the next. And one of the things that I think that I'm trying to be more aware of in that regard is, if you took all of the rules text, all of the game text out of an adventure and just had to read box text from one to the next, are those things following logically in such a way that all of them are necessary? And when you engage with it like that, I think you also find that there are ways that you describe or tell the story in a piece of box text that is actually superfluous, and they just kind of adding more words because you're in love with your own voice, but also that you're not thinking very deliberately about what box text is actually doing for the player and for the DM, from a storytelling perspective and from the perspective of actually giving them useful information. So,
all right, I have to know, as the progenitor of this question, what is the correct length of box text? Thor.
Well, like the others, I don't know. I think that in general, I'm pretty suspicious of box text. I think it's used often when it doesn't need to be. So in some cases, it might be 0. I think keeping it, if you are going to use it, keep it very short, keep it snappy. Touch on the major things that the player should know, and then they can investigate further. And I think perhaps the best example of that model are the Parsley games by my friend Jared Sorensen, which, if you don't know, they are analog text-based computer adventures, like Zork. If you know what Zork is, I'm dating myself.
Sorry.
But Jared manages to encapsulate a location in a very brief sentence or two, and then lets the player, or players in this case, investigate further. I think he does it really, really well.
My answer from this question is that the opening text for every Star Wars film is about 3 sentences, and they go on for way too long. So it's definitely less than 3.
It's also definitely less than the box text in Temple of the Frog.
Yes.
I time myself up to that point where you encounter that 4,000-year-old coin, and just that part, which is maybe a third of that box text, took 5 minutes.
Yes, it is an intense scene.
Yeah.
So this one comes from @Stephen Garstone. How important is providing the tone of the adventure when writing box text? How does removing box text affect the tone of adventures? Let's start with, I'm curious about Brandon's interpretation here, because you write a lot of science fiction games, and I think sci-fi tends to need a lot of tone setting.
I mean, yes, this is true. I am inclined to believe that it is still very possible to set a lot of the stage in terms of world building in sci-fi without necessarily requiring box text. That you can engage with that as sidebars, or even just give the DM and the players the opportunity to just engage with setting on its own terms before we even get to story. I would rather, I think, give a DM 2 pages of sidebar in one fell swoop and then tell them this is where the story begins and they just get to engage with the story, than have story be broken up by 2 pages of box text telling them, well, this is this character expositing all of their concerns about one sci-fi unobtainium or another.
Merric,
How often have you used, as the creator of one of my favorite modules, I know I missed the S when we were doing the credits page, but how do you interpret tone setting from box text?
It's a box text is where the designer gets to actually impart that to the players without needing the DM to work it out themselves. And this is really, really important because you can say things to the DM and they won't pick up on them. But when you have a box text, you have a way of actually directly communicating an idea to the players and helping the DM do it as well. So for the beginning, so with introductory box text, you don't want to go too long, but you have the opportunity there to set the tone. That's the time when I think you can go longer and you should go longer. Because for a horror setting in particular, it is so important to give that sense of unease that this is not your regular place.
Tor, I'm going to plug in one of your adventures, technically all of them, because every adventure I've participated in that you have written, I have experienced the difficulty that is being the seventh son of some poor farmer, and I must scrape by to survive. I have never felt like I had the situation completely in my control, but you don't use as much text as many other writers.
I try to be as spare as possible because it's hard for people to listen and to actually process information in the moment, especially if you overload them. You know, it's funny that you say that because at BWHQ they tease me for writing long. You know, I try to get more and more spare as I go. Yeah, and in fact, in my last adventure, I tried to eliminate the box text entirely. And then, of course, we're doing this compilation, and they designed the layout around having box text, and so I had to add it back in.
Oh, no.
Because it was going to look weird without it. So, but I agree with Brandon and Merric that, you know, this is where you have the opportunity to express tone. I think that is the best reason to use it. In many instances. That said, I think that there are ways to approach it as a writer without, you know, giving lots of box text. I think two examples that I'm looking at that came out recently that I absolutely adore are an adventure called Lorne Song of the Bachelor by a Malaysian designer named ZXU, and I'm sure I'm butchering that name. Zedek doesn't use box text or read-along text so much as just a very short descriptive phrase for each location. I'm looking at one, it's a wreck. There's a supernatural crocodile involved on a river, right? And the description for wreck is half a boat stuck on a shoal, perfume spices on the wind. That's it.
That's pretty good.
Right? And that gives the game master the tools to describe what's happening. It creates a tone, but it's not a ton of read-along text. The other one that I've been looking at a lot is one that came out, I think, last year, 2 years ago, The Dark of Hot Springs Island.
Hot Springs Island.
Yeah, it's by a group called the Swordfish Islands. So one of the things that they do instead of having box text, each location has a description with some bold words that the GM can sort of grab onto and use as part of their own description, right? So lookout point is a giant basalt outcrop. There are gray splotches. There's a boar head on a spear, and there's a stairway, right? And you use that in combination with the map, and you've got the things that you need now to describe what's going on. And what I really love about this is not only does it allow the GM to describe things in their own words, but it allows them to be dynamic. I think one of the big failings of box text, in my opinion, is that if the situation changes, the GM is left trying to edit it on the fly as they're reading it and say, no, that no longer applies. I've got to change this, right? Yeah. So this gives them the tools to do that on the fly without getting stuck in that situation.
Well, I'm going to take that and
now look to my audience and say, make sure you consider every decision your players are making. And whenever a piece of adventure writing has something that hasn't been accounted for, it's up to the dungeon master and the players to make sure to bridge that gap cleanly and expertly. I have a lot of people to thank and a lot of sources I need to cite. And after I've gotten through those, I hope all of my panelists can plug all of their latest works. I first want to thank Clinton Deegan for letting me use the classic song from my youth, I'm Not Fooled. Ethan Spearman provided all of the art that we've seen. Ethan Spearman's got a website, Facebook, and is fairly active on Instagram. The Imperial Assault theme, which is a board game, not the movies, was provided by Tara Straza from YouTube, and Slap Happy Jack, as far as I can tell, is an original creation by Trixie Wizard from TrixieWizard.com. And I'd also like to personally thank Paul Thresher, our editor, for cleaning up our conversations. So Brandon, where can people find you, and what's your latest projects?
Hi, I'm Brandon. You can find me almost anywhere on the internet at The Rising Tides. That's The Rising TITHES. I have an itch.io storefront where I sell a lot of my indie projects, including two of my latest things are a small indie game called Hot-Blooded Cool-Headed Lovers. I also recently put out a crew supplement for Blades in the Dark that allows you to play fugitives in the style of Richard Kimball, because I thought that would be a really neat thing to do. And I'm presently working on my own very big RPG called Sound Clash, which is about starting your own band in a universe where music has now gained magical properties, and discovering that that music industry is still terrible and has actually become more terrible as a result of magic being involved. So look out for more of that.
Thor.
We are in the finishing stages of completing our Torchbearer 2nd Edition Kickstarter. Not currently for sale, but hopefully will be very soon. Also, Bridge of the Damned, same deal. We are processing the final edits and hopefully sending that to the printer very shortly. It's been delayed a little bit by COVID. You can find me on Twitter at Mimir9. I don't post that much, but I do occasionally. Also at my blog, torchbearerrpg.com and forums.burningwheel.com.
Merric.
You'll find me most commonly on Twitter, where I am generally very active, so Merric V. I also have a website, merricv.com, where I write reviews and write an awful lot about Dungeons and Dragons. I'm hoping to shortly get back to reviewing, exploring Eberron, which I'm taking a very in-depth look at. Yeah, and so most of my stuff you'll find on my website.
And I would like to make a special plug for our secret fourth panelist. He's been connected to this project since the very beginning. They were ready to jump in if necessary. Derek DaSilva from The Laughing Axe. I love his designs. He doesn't tweet as often as some folks, but when he does, it carries impact. And I want to take special mention of the famous, infamous Dungeons and Dragons Adventure League organized play module thing, the Haggard Heroes, known for being the deadliest module in Adventure League. And the rewards are so worth it, believe me. I guarantee it. I would like to thank all of my panelists for being here with me today. I hope you guys have a wonderful PAX Online, and thank you for watching our show.